it was chapter 2, and then again in chapter 5, you touched on some unhelpful approaches that Christians in previous centuries had taken, and you talked about the parallelomania
Right.
when Babylonian texts, the Numa Elish and Atrahasis epic and other these stories people found, archaeologists were finally able to literally uncover, and then linguists were able to decipher, and then it just became this like everything's a parallel to everything. And then when the Rosh Hashanah tablets were found, and the Ugaritic
Right.
parallels, which here on the channel we just have been teaching through the Baal saga and actually reading the text, not in Ugaritic, but seeing the story, it was as if there was this parallel. We got to find all the parallels. Now, what is the proper way? What would you say is the proper way to do that versus the improper or the excessive way? Because there are clearly, as we've seen in our Baal series here, there are numerous, almost verbatim echoes in scripture of the Ugaritic Baal myth, as well as the other Babylonian and from the Hittite uh, treaties and all of these. There are clear parallels: Egyptian wisdom literature, egyptian
Right.
egyptian erotic literature, and Song of Songs. Parallels exist. So how do you what's the proper way to note the parallels without committing parallelomania?
Yeah, so parallelomania, as you mentioned, is sort of understandable once people retreat from their older view that we are totally unique culturally, and the Bible is totally unique culturally. But with the recognition that there were other cultures around the Bible, that the Bible itself has a context, then people get nervous because they realize that the Bible may not be as special as they had originally thought, that itself being an unrealistic and extreme version of the contextual interpretation. So I think it's kind of useful to look at just one particular case of this, in which people realize that you have to trace both the similarities and the differences when it comes to these texts.
Right.
So in 1901 is when the laws of Hammurabi were discovered and then quickly deciphered. And this made the Christian public in Europe and North America quite nervous because here you have a Babylonian king who clearly predates Moses, talking about ethical regulations and punishment related to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So here begins that parallelomania in which people are just jumping to conclusions that Moses plagiarized from Babylon. And then later on, the same thing happens, as you mentioned, with the Ugaritic texts. The key thing to do is something you have already alluded to, which is first to realize that we come to the Bible and any other ancient text with a certain set of cultural presuppositions. As with all interpretation of the past or some form of other, whether it's a literary other like the Old Testament or cultural others like non-Western cultures, what we bring to our encounter with the other influences what we take away as well. Now, this was lost on the Assyriologists who were making the claims of parallelomania.
Mm.
But over time, people have been able to see that the laws of Hammurabi may have superficial similarities with the Mosaic Law. But once we truly place them next to each other and do a deeper kind of comparison, then the differences that emerge are just as important as the similarities. And so this is what I mean in the book when I say that the Old Testament is both contextual and contextualizing.
Mm.
That might be a helpful way to summarize my understanding of contextualization. The similarities are important because the Old Testament builds bridges with its world so that the law of Moses is recognizably an ancient law code. People aren't looking at it and saying, this is so different from anything else we have. It's like a special revelation that dropped from heaven on a sheet.
Mm.
Um, it's not going to be quite like that. Instead, there are going to be real similarities that make it intelligible as culturally and historically located communication, but it's also going to be different. And the differences are quite prominent. For example, in the laws of Hammurabi, The eye for an eye and the tooth for a tooth only apply when people of the same social class or rank hurt each other. But in the laws of Moses, we have a diminishment of hierarchy so that every Israelite gets justice and the rule of law, regardless of who they are. And so this is going to be a major contextualizing feature of the law of Moses. And on top of that, this is not just a book of law. These are the expectations for a people who have already been saved by the initiative of a God who took them out of Egypt. That whole backstory, that whole narrative of salvation is totally foreign to the context of Hammurabi's laws. So we have to do the contextual work to see how things fit in their world, but also the contextualizing work to see what has been used, modified, or reused in the process. And that's what I try to do in the book. But as you mentioned earlier, sometimes we have to externalize the problem. The Bible is a bit too close to us. So when we go to Asian cultures and then we take a glance back at Western cultures, then we somehow see things more clearly. It's almost like how travel anywhere leads us to a form of reverse culture shock.
Right,
And then
right.
we realize that, oh, this what I thought was normal, that's just me. That's just my family. That's just the way we do things here. But that's not universal.
Yeah. Yes, that's a key point, and I want viewers to um, keep this in mind when you start to see these parallels in the ancient world. The temptation, if you don't run from them, some people run from them. On our Baal series, we've had comments, "Oh, why are you giving the devil a platform, and why are you, all this stuff?" And
Right.
but then there have been more comments from people that see the surface similarities or the similar imagery, and they go, "Oh, this is just shows that Yahweh is just a copy of El or Baal or fill in the blank
Right.
with any ancient pantheon." And
Right.
what you're saying is crucial. Is you don't run from the differences. Like, notice the differences. It's how you communicate into a culture,
Yeah.
but at the
Yeah.
same time, I mean, the similarities. Notice the similarities. The similarities how you communicate a culture, but at the same time, the differences
Yeah.
are vast and they're profound. The Hammurabi Code you mentioned, it's a great example. We had Jay Sklar on here, and he talked about one of the Hammurabi Code laws and did the same thing, compared it to Scripture, and you saw like, oh, this seems to be surface level. This seems to be the same, but when you dig deeper, just like you
Right.
did with the eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and you go, oh yeah, that only applied if it was a higher class person. If a slave did something against a higher class person, the slave didn't get any justice.
Yeah. You just pay them off.
Yeah,
They don't lose
that
their eye. They don't lose their tooth.
yeah, it becomes it like turns up the volume on the differences, and that's what going through the whether it's the Baal myth or any of the other ancient texts, the Numa Elish or whatever, the
Right.
surface similarities. Some people, that's as far as they ever go, and they just run with it. Oh, Moses copied Babylonian tablets, and the Hebrews just made up. They just co-opted the other gods and stuck their name on it. And that tells me that that person has not spent time reading the primary sources. They haven't done a deep dive into the ancient Near East culture and literature, because if they had, they would see exactly what you're saying. The differences far outweigh the similarities. The similarities are surface. The differences are profound and
Right.
theological.